jump in on that in a moment. All right. Okay, here we go. I've got different cameras, so you won't be quite seeing what I'm going to see. Oh, we should pray. Can I have a quick prayer before we go? Yeah, dear Lord, we just want to say thank you for this opportunity to come and to speak, to be together. Thank you for what you've done in David's life and his ministry in speaking the truth to the various things that challenge your ways. And Lord, we just ask in the name of Jesus that you would really move powerfully through us today, that you would say the things that you want said, and you would keep us from saying things that you don't want said. And in doing so, Lord, you would really just have the message in mind for those who will watch this down the road. You know who's going to watch this in the times to come, Lord. So please possess our mouths, say what you want said, and keep us from saying anything that you don't want said. Guard our lips, Lord. But ultimately, we pray you be glorified in all that we do, and that many people would experience your joy, your freedom, your transformation as they tune in. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Right. Yeah, still recording. I'm going to have a couple of goes at the intro. Something profound has happened in Western culture. We've seen a decline in masculinity. We've seen skyrocketing rates of LGBT association, and we've definitely seen a war on fathers. Something profound has changed in Western culture. We have seen constant criticisms of masculinity. We've seen a decline in fathers, and we've seen a surge in LGBT identification. Doctor, just... Something profound has changed in Western culture. We've seen declining masculinity. We've seen something profound has changed in Western culture. We've seen masculinity be constantly criticized. We've seen fatherhood and fathers in the decline, and we've seen a surge of LGBTIQ identification. Could these trends be connected? Well, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi has done research that looks at the various causes of LGBT identification and has studied the primary attachments and family dynamics in childhood and adolescence. And there's something to talk about. And today we're with our guest, a special guest, Dr. David Maywald. Sorry, I almost gave you a doctorate. Something profound has changed in Western culture. We've seen masculinity constantly criticized. There's been a decline in fatherhood, and of course, we've seen a surge in LGBTIQ identification. Now, are these trends in some way connected? Well, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi has conducted extensive research looking at the root causes behind LGBT identification, looking at family attachments and roles and relationships in childhood and adolescence, and how they can impact our view of sex and sexuality later in life. And today, we're with a very special guest, David Maywald, who has written a groundbreaking book, The Relentless War on Masculinity. And we're going to have a great discussion. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a really clear picture on the relationship between healthy sexual formation and masculinity, how it is that we can walk out healthy masculinity in our culture without diminishing it, and what it could mean for you as you consider your role in society. Enjoy. So, I might just do a slightly different ending. And in this episode, you'll learn how and by the end of this episode, you'll understand how really extreme LGBT advocacy came about, the effects of feminine. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a clear understanding about how extreme LGBT activism came about the effects of feminism and where it's targeted. To articulate feminism. And by the end of this episode, you'll learn all about it. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand just how the extreme LGBT advocacy ended up coming about, how you're confident to articulate. And by the end of this episode, you'll have learned how extreme LGBT activism actually came about. You'll understand and be able to articulate the effects of feminism in targeting men and the war on men, and how you can live in a constructive way in this present age. Enjoy. Right, we got something there. That's great stuff. All right, the origins. Okay, here we go. So I'd love to. So I'm pleased to introduce David Maywald, the author of The Relentless War on Masculinity. David, thank you so much for being with us today on the Love Questions podcast.
Great to be here with you, PJ. I look forward to chatting.
Brilliant, mate. Well, we've seen the title, The Relentless War on Masculinity, and I would love to understand a bit of the origin story. I'm sure people watching might want to understand the same thing. What was the moment for you where you felt, because I really need to write and explore the issue? I'm going to start again, sorry. I'm going to do it a little different. So today we're with our guest. So today we're with special guest David Maywald, the author of The Relentless War on Masculinity. David, thanks so much for making time and being with us today on the Love Questions podcast.
Fantastic to be here with you, PJ. I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, for those who don't know your work and don't know the book, there might be a question about why you're here on this podcast, and we really do see and love to explore and discuss connections, ask big questions, challenging questions, and part of today's question is there a connection? Is there a relationship between the way masculinity has been treated and the way human sexuality has morphed and changed and sort of accelerated in this time? But as we move into that and have those discussions, David, I thought we could begin with some origins. You obviously at some point decided that you needed to conduct research and write the book, and you entitled that book The Relentless War on Masculinity. I'm just intrigued. Was there a moment for you that brought you into this fight, into this area, and what was that moment?
It was a series of moments over many years. So I was very fortunate to grow up in a very stable Christian family and benefited from that enormously. I was recruited, in a sense, to be a male feminist, to be an ally, to be a supporter, to lift up girls and women. And I guess I related to that, and that was the ocean I was swimming in, and that's what I was exposed to, like so many other people in those decades. But after becoming a father to a son and a daughter, it really gave me a different perspective, a forward-looking perspective, and it really made me think about, are we giving boys the same opportunities, the same dignity and respect that we're giving to girls? And three of the books that influenced me are all written by women, and their titles are The War Against Boys, The War on Men, The Toxic War on Masculinity. That really made me think about what we've done in our societies, why we've got such deep double standards there, such huge asymmetries in the way that we treat males and females. So gradually over time, I came to this realization that there was a big void, especially in Australia, a lack of voices who were speaking up and honestly talking about their experiences. And I wanted to try and add something constructive to that space.
I'm so glad that you did. Was there something that you were kind of hoping that you might wake people up to? Was there something that you'd awoken to in your reading and speaking about female authors and just these other titles? What were you hoping when you set out to write the book? What were you hoping people would see? What was the core learning that you wanted to see more widely known?
So part of the research for the book was having hundreds of conversations with men and women of different ages, many fathers and mothers. And one-on-one, they were telling me things about the aspirations and the concerns for their children. And in particular, what really stood out was the mothers having concerns for their sons about education, about work, about family, potential future grandchildren. Will they get the same opportunities that we had, that I had, that the older generations had? And so I wasn't as much saying anything new. What I've done is give people the courage to express what they already think and how they already feel and what's already moving in their spirit. But so many people in the last few years have been reluctant or felt cancelled or felt diminished and not able to speak their truth. And I was in a position to speak courageously. And since the book came out and in general in the last year or two, many, many more people have been willing to speak up and look in an honest, balanced way at our social dynamics and where the culture's going.
Mm-hmm. If you had a headline for viewers, and we'll put the links to your book in the just down below, and you can get your hands on it. We'd really recommend that. But in the meantime, to summarize for someone some of the key learning, some of the things that have struck you as insightful and maybe needing our attention, what would you say the standout points are from what you've written?
In particular, I just emphasise what we're already being taught, that every person is equal in dignity and worthy of respect in the eyes of God, that there's no moral or spiritual case for uplifting particular groups and pushing other groups down, that we really need to strive to uplift everyone and to give everyone an opportunity to contribute to their families and to our community.
I love it. You don't fight sexism with sexism, you don't fight racism with racism. That only leads to chaos. Okay, let me play, I suppose, devil's advocate in some way. Someone watching this might say, yeah, but men have had the advantage for so long. We just need to look at the effects of the patriarchy in suppressing others, especially minority groups. Surely we don't need another support group for the dominant sex in culture. Surely what we need to do is hold males to account for the historical abuses and things like that. How would you respond to that? And how does what you've read, how does the literature respond to that?
I'd say that's a really warped and one-sided view of history. And I'd actually, counter and say it's males who've been disposable in every society, in every age, throughout humanity. It's males who have sacrificed themselves physically for their families, for the communities who put themselves at high risk in the most risky jobs, building the physical infrastructure, going to war, protecting their families and communities. So it's never been true that all males have oppressed all females. That's just patently not true on the evidence. I'll give you two examples which really counter that. Through all of recorded history, females have lived longer than males. And partly that's because males have willingly taken on those risky roles. They've put themselves in harm's way to help others. Not for their own benefit, but actually to help the other people, their family members, their community members. Another aspect which comes from DNA evidence is that about twice as many females throughout humanity have had children than males. So if you think about what a good life is, a worthy life, living longer and having progeny are two pretty fundamental aspects of being a human, of having existed. If you live a short life and don't get to have children, that's it, you're wiped out. You've had less existence. Your line is finished. And it's actually females, in both cases, that have systematically throughout all of humanity had the benefit of passing on their DNA and living for longer. So the history that we've emphasised in the West, in English-speaking countries, in Australia, it's a biased, warped view of history. It's a feminised view of history. Let's open it up, just like Australian history needs to accept and be honest. Let's open it up and let's have the proper debates we need to have. Not the name-calling and the cancelling and the denigration of half of humanity. Let's have the sensible discussions, the balanced discussions that we need to have.
It is, I've always thought, part of me has always had a problem with injustice. Just where there was an objective injustice, I've always thought, that's not right, we can't have that. But it always struck me that some of the things which maybe it's female-only groups were capable, even sort of honoured for saying regarding men, because it was perceived as sort of righting some historical wrong, it struck me that they were totally unfair things to say, and that if it was reversed, the group of guys sat around saying, we want to make sure we keep this space free from women, or we want to make sure we are cautious of the abusive nature of women. We'd all be saying, well, that's just a sexist remark, but when it was on the other foot, it just seems totally fine. I think many young men have emerged out of that, scratching their heads. And is this part of the broader picture behind the title for the book? Is this part of the broader picture behind what might constitute a war on masculinity? And what are the other elements? What does this war look like?
So, as I describe in the first chapter of the book, what I'm painting a narrative of is a cultural, rhetorical, chemical, legal and institutional assault on all males. And the book's specifically about the English-speaking countries. So I'm not talking about Africa or impoverished countries or underdeveloped countries. I'm specifically talking here about advanced, high-income countries, the five main English-speaking countries, the US, UK, Australia, Canada and New Zealand. So that's the scope of what I'm tackling inside the book. And within those countries, what we've seen, particularly second wave feminism, it was about educational and economic empowerment. And it had particular narratives. It was focusing on jobs, financial independence, autonomy. It was quite sort of capitalist and market-driven and consumer interested. And in some respects, parts of our history, of our shared Western history, are about the dimorph between females and males, and the way that we've divided that labour, the way that we have emphasised nurturing for females and for mothers, and we've cherished and we've put motherhood up on a pedestal in previous generations, at the same time as allowing males to engage in entrepreneurial, innovative, economic activities outside of the home in a different way. And that was celebrated. And it was very successful for decades, for centuries, as we celebrated the covenant of Christian marriage and really cherished that as a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. So we cherish that. But in the last 50 years, that's been demolished and undermined and deconstructed. And we've got to the point now where boys, teenage boys, young men, are being they are being held to an unrealistic account. They are being punished for some perceived injustices which might have been there at the time of their great-grandfathers, 80 years ago, 150 years ago. They are feeling the punishment, the vengeance, the retaliation of quite extreme feminist ideology that is blaming them and taking away opportunities from them for something that they've never benefited from. That's deeply immoral. It's certainly not Christian in its worldview or in its implementation. And for the sake of our societies and our future generations, we need to change course very dramatically.
Yeah, you can just see the tentacles everywhere. Maybe just drilling down a little bit on that changing course. What are some of the areas that, just even now we could see things shift if there was the will and the recognition that, hey, this just is not right? Can you think of some of those, perhaps they're practical areas where all of us can step into becoming the change that we want to see?
So I'll talk about two areas, cultural and institutional. So culturally, what we've become accustomed to is affirmative action, which only goes in one direction. So when you look at our media, our entertainment, our education, our preferences culturally, the softer sort of stuff, we continually elevate females at the same time as criticising or holding back males. So you see this in the classroom. Boys are the problem, but we provide advantages and benefits to girls and praise to girls. There's a huge empathy gap. Empathy is quite easily, allocated to females of all ages, but empathy is withheld or withdrawn from males. So that's the cultural side. There's some pretty deep and searching questions there for each of us as individuals, as people who are involved culturally in our societies. Then there's institutional. So what I describe in the book is that in the last 30 years or so, the English-speaking countries have gone from being culturally gynocentric, so preferencing and favouring females, to becoming institutionally gynocentric. And that's when the preferences are embedded into laws, they're embedded into new institutions, they are put into the mission statements of organisations, the appointments are made to their boards and to their executives, and that solidifies the institutional rigidity of affirmative action and preferences for females. And we need to reflect on just how deeply we have embedded those things into the agencies. For example, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. By far, it used to have about 90% females in it. It forces large businesses to disclose a meaningless and misleading metric of so-called gender wage gap that doesn't account for how risky those jobs are. It doesn't account for the unpaid overtime. It doesn't account for having to travel a long way away from your home to take part in those jobs. And it doesn't account for the convenience of things like working from home. All of those are unequally spread between males and females. At the end of that calculation, you get a meaningless metric that comes out that's used as propaganda in the media by leftists, and it's used by feminists. So there are some deep searching questions here, both culturally and institutionally, about how we have embedded assumptions that are biased assumptions, and how on earth, do we wind back from where we've got to?
Yeah, the saying, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics, and so much I see in the realm of conservative versus neo-Marxist influences on the academy, on the scientific literature, and just time and time again, you would have to say, I don't think it's a mistake where they fail to control. They fail to use a control group and to control for things like risk and travel and all of these other areas. And so the data which is being presented is skewed, and it empowers a narrative that just, it seems to me no one's willing to question. No one's willing to say, hold on, that can we just scratch the surface a little bit? That's not actually true. And what you think it's saying, it isn't saying. The whole compared to what question, which usually brings many of these assertions unstuck.
So that's political activism. That's not an impartial search for truth through an academic, research-driven process. That's pure biased activism.
Yeah, it's acknowledged in many of the, particularly in the, in regards to identity politics, particularly in many of the papers around queer theory and others in critical race theory. Openly in the abstracts of many papers is the statement, we intend this research to disrupt oppressive power structures. So the stated goal is not research. It's not what we used to think science was, which was endeavoring to be empirical in our observations of observable things and draw conclusions based on reason and logic. But instead, we see the academy, the institutions, openly deploying resources towards disrupting what they have deemed to be oppressive structures. And so it doesn't really matter whether they went about assessing the data in a reasonable and objective manner. What matters is that they get the outcome that they set out to get when they started the paper. So you can see how it's corrupted deeply, and we live in a world that's so dreadfully impacted by that. How do we get past that, David? It's probably an impossible question, but how do we bring that whole machinery back into some sort of logical order?
That's a fantastic question, BJ. And when we've seen several decades of a march through the institutions, a deliberate program of attempting to shift culture and then to embed that within institutions, to then be accused of propagating a culture war, it's quite phenomenal gaslighting, and it's a stark propaganda. So this is the huge monumental effort of our times. And when I look at that long sweep of history, whether we're talking about the general sweep of social sciences, as you've just been discussing, or whether we're talking about female empowerment, both of those things took several decades to become embedded to get to the point where we are now. And it's unrealistic to think that a big switch back to the state of 5 decades ago will happen quickly. I think what's more likely is that we're able to convince centrist, sensible people who are open to persuasion and open to influence. I think there's a proportion of people at the extremes that won't be influenced. They won't change their minds. They'll stick with these views through maybe the rest of their lives. But there is a contest and a war for ideas that's able to be reasoned and articulated at the centre. And one thing I was really pleased with was to see Gerard Holland on the stage of the International Convention Centre in Sydney talking about the social science research on fatherlessness. Just how dramatically negative an impact of broken families and fatherlessness has on boys and girls. And that's seen through the data in education attainment, in terms of incarceration, in terms of mental health, in terms of income, in terms of quality of life. So many different areas. Even with the bias of many academics, it's still visible. There's a mountain of social science research there that backs up intact mothers and fathers caring for their own biological children. It backs up just how crucial fathers are for their children.
Absolutely. If we could draw that, perhaps it's not a long bow, but just draw that bow back and take a look at what we also see in culture. And we see it in the academy, we see it in scientific literature, but we also see it in observable ways in our culture, the sort of how you put it, the queerification of our culture. We are seeing you just turn the TV on, and what has rapidly become normal is that every other piece of advertising or TV show will have an LGBT protagonist or a negative assessment or negative sort of implication aimed at heteronormative life. That is I think that's very plain to see for most people, and that's happened quickly. That if you're over 20, you realize it wasn't always that way. That has moved quickly. I wonder if there's a connection that we can explore between the war on masculinity and this rapid change in LGBT identification. There's obviously some academic work, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi and others, but I thought first I'd love to hear from you. What role do fathers and male mentors play in helping young men develop healthy sexuality, healthy life, healthy relationships, healthy marriages, and go on to be functioning members of our society?
So one of the most impactful works that I've read in that space is Manhood in the Making by David Gilmour, which came out in 1990. And it's a cross-cultural study. It looks at traditional societies and through the ages, many different backgrounds from all of the continents. And it has some consistent themes. The rites of passage for young men being super important. The loving elder men who are involved in the community. Obviously the fathers there might be uncles, there might be some other blood relations, but there's this group of loving older men who have life experience. Most, if not all of them, are fathers. And there's some quite dramatic scenes in that book where Gilmour paints this picture of these middle-aged or older men coming in to approach the teenage boy, and in some of the traditional cultures he talks about having to physically cleave him away from his mother. The boy wants the comfort and protection of being in the home, of not having responsibility, of not having to separate from his mother. And it's these loving men who take him for the rites of passage, for the initiations, the teachings, the hardening, toughening up for life, and just how brutal in some cases it can be to protect your community, to earn a living, to fight in the marketplace. It's a very vivid picture. Another one that's very moving and impactful for me is Celia Lashley in her book from about 2005, I think it is, called He'll Be Okay. And Celia is a mother of a son and a daughter. She paints this picture of a bridge of adolescence in the sense that the teenage boy has to cross this bridge from childhood into adulthood towards manhood. And the mother's not able to walk across this bridge with the boy. She has to watch on from a distance. She's played a very important role and still has a role to play in his life. But the boy has to make this journey. And it's the loving elder men who are there around the bridge, ready to catch him if he falls, ready to pick him back up and keep him moving forwards, to share the wisdom and the insights that he'll need in coming years and decades. So these pictures, I think, paint a very strong portrait for us about what's needed in the lives of boys and young men. They need role models. They need, an ear that's different. It's a male ear. It communicates differently. It has a different type of connection and empathy from the female ear. And unfortunately, too many boys in English-speaking countries don't have that. They might be in a single-parent family, of which about 80% are led by females. About a third of schools in the UK don't have male teachers. So there are many boys going through this time of life, this formative, crucial time. They don't have sufficient masculinity in their lives. Now, just step back to the aspects of the war on masculinity. I talked about cultural and rhetorical. If you constantly denigrate something that's innate to people, they can't change it. You can't change your sex. No one's ever changed their sex. You are a male. You're a boy. You're becoming a man. If you constantly denigrate that, and if at the same time you're elevating girls and young women, well, then you're going to push people onto the back foot. You're going to make them feel bad about their essence, about what's inside them. And that is going to push some males towards looking for what on earth else can they do? You know, if I'm not being accepted as a boy, as a man, as a male, maybe I'll pretend to be a woman. Maybe I'll do something else to game this system to get ahead in some way. I think that's what concerns me, is that we wouldn't do this to women. We wouldn't do this to minorities or to Indigenous people. It's a form of psychological torture or warfare against individuals. If you send hundreds or thousands of messages that a boy is innately bad and he will hurt other people, that's corrosive. It's demotivating and dispiriting. So I think that what we've seen in identification with non-binary or LGBT or other aspects, I think it partly is related, maybe indirectly, but I think it does play a role.
Yeah, fascinating. There is it is psychological warfare to be told that who you are over a prolonged period of time, who you are is not right, and you need to apologise, can only introduce shame, can really only make someone wonder about their sense of purpose. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a connection between the high and growing and higher rate of male suicide, particularly in adolescence, now to what we'd have to call epidemic proportions. The leading cause of death for males, 18 to 30, remains to be suicide. Absolutely extraordinary that we're really not looking at these factors with any real sense of political urgency when the death rate is so high, when the death toll is so high. With cardiovascular disease or breast cancer, there would be funding to boot, and people would be asking the hard questions, but for whatever reason, because it's maybe it's due to advocacy and an unwillingness to depart from the established narrative that it's men's fault, there really doesn't seem to be any will to look at those issues very seriously at all, and not to give credit to the magnitude of the problem. David, when I think about the removal of, for various reasons, but the removal of the influence of a father on so many of those lives, and shared statistics about 80% of divorcees, where there's access or custody with one parent, 80% going to female and not male. So we see now the divorce rates being up at potentially 50%, and we'd be talking about a huge population that grows up without meaningful access to a father, with restricted access to their primary male attachment, the one who's going to love them in a masculine sense like no one else can and will. We also see higher incarceration rates for men, and of course there are other factors. There are workplace restrictions, workplace deaths, of course, but also men with the cost of living particularly bearing that burden, spending long hours at work. So where there's not necessarily a total deprivation of a father, sometimes there can be a functional deprivation. All of this is reducing the impact of what you shared earlier, the impact of a loving and older male role model, speaking into and growing and nurturing their sons and daughters, of course. I just can't help but ponder that connection. We're seeing a surge in LGBT, and we're seeing a sort of reduction in fatherhood. And from what I've read of the work of many who have grappled with the root causes of LGBT association or identification, there is a very common trend. It's actually heartbreaking. A very commonly described trend that when a same-sex attracted man reflects upon their childhood, they really desired male affection, really desired deep male connection, and always, for many friends, they described always feeling like they were on the out. They were never in with the males. They didn't have that sense of of being welcomed into the brotherhood. And so for many, they describe trying to find that connection sexually. It's devastating. We in many ways, when we diminish fathers, we do unspeakable damage to their children, to the generation of children that
Mm,
are raised fatherless.
absolutely. And, fathers in this generation, I think they're quite switched on to that. They realise just how important it is to be actively involved, to be accepting, but also to challenge, to push their children to independence. And I think culturally, we probably need to accept the differences between mothers and fathers a bit more than we do. We're not just amorphous parents. I'm a father. I'd never introduce myself to someone and say, I'm a parent to a son and a daughter. That's ridiculous. I am their father, their biological father. I teach and communicate and interact with them in a way that's different to my wife, to their mother, because she's a woman. And we need to cherish both. I think both motherhood and fatherhood have been diminished culturally over the last 5 or 6 decades, and they deserve a prime position socially. They should be exalted and cherished, and they should be honoured, just like we're taught from the Bible. A mother and a father are there in the family unit. That's the most important social institution for raising our next generation. Governments will never replace that. You have to be joking to think that a government could ever provide anything close to. They can't substitute for that. Childcare can't substitute for that. That's why it's so important to not overcommit yourself. I mean, you don't have to have a big house to raise a good family, to be a decent mother or a decent father. They want your time, your affection, your love, your presence. Kids understand that parents have to work, that they're not always going to be there. So I think it's much better to earn less money but stay close to your extended family, or to live somewhere that's not as nice as you'd like to maybe in a couple of decades' time. Give your kids more of your precious time. That's the most valuable resource you've got at your disposal. Stay home for longer. Have kids earlier when you're physically more capable, when you can actually enjoy the rough play, when you can run around and keep up with them with all of their boundless energy. See the positives that come out of that. I mean, children are such a blessing. We are so fortunate to share our lives. Have them earlier. Have more children. Have a longer time when you'll be able to enjoy that overlap between your life and their life and your grandchildren, and see the generations unfold. It's such a blessing. It's by no means a burden. And I always reorient towards how positive and how worthy it is to be a parent and to be blessed by your children.
So good, David. I've just got to do something to the camera, so just sit up for 1 minute. Just switch off this other one. Okay, there we go. Sorry, David. Just got
All
something.
good.
Okay, we're still going. Um, yeah. David, just give me a quick refresh on do you remember the last sentence that you said?
Being blessed by having children.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, David, absolutely. There is, I think, a resurgence, called a renaissance of traditional fatherhood, traditional parenting, traditional motherhood too, which really does tap into this idea that the children need both their parents, children need their mum and their dad. Children don't need a birthing parent or non-birthing parents. I mean, it's so crazy uh, the way language gets manipulated, but there is something irreplaceable about what both sexes bring to a family, and it's precious. And why on earth uh, people would want to diminish that and rob children of that, uh, what I would call an ordained blessing in their life, to have both sexes be their parents, is beyond me. But what I do see in an encouraging light is many mothers actually, as they get older and their children get older, and who maybe at one point in time or other really did drink the feminist Kool-Aid and think that it was really about emancipation from the patriarchy. Once they have children, and particularly once they have young men, young boys, they realize that taking offense at the other sex has accomplished nothing. And it's had actually a devastating negative impact on young boys and young men. And a mother truly does see that impact, and often there's a dramatic shift later in life. Um, we can be mutually encouraging. Uh, how do you see that playing out, where we don't deny or diminish um, those very valid hurts that people have experienced through perhaps a chauvinistic attitude, um, or a legitimate complaint, that I've been mistreated by a man, or whatever that is. How have you seen a coming together and something way more positive that can help us move forward in bringing out the best for our children, especially for our young men?
Well, the gendered lens that we viewed relations between the sexes through has been a narrow lens. It's only been seeing parts of these stories. So by emphasising particular grievances, by only focusing on female victims and male perpetrators, we've put blinkers on ourselves. And unfortunately, that has meant stigmatisation of male victims. And it's also meant that we haven't seen female perpetration of different types of violence for what it actually is, which is bad behaviour. It's sinful. It shouldn't be condoned. And now I think we're going through this healthy process of reassessing and taking the blinkers off, and of looking at the bigger picture. And I think that process would always be uncomfortable for some people, but in the end I think it's very healthy from a social perspective. If you think about social health, post-World War II, one thing was that we needed to repopulate, right? So there was a blip up in birth rates, which went to between 3 and 4 for each woman in the 1950s and 1960s. And that was actually a little high compared to the past, because there were so many, particularly young men, who were lost during the generation that was fighting in World War II. So what we had at that time was about 3/4 of men and women during their life would become a parent to at least one son and at least one daughter. So the vast majority of adults were going to have a blood relation to males and females of the next generation. And what that embedded was a deep empathy and understanding, and a familiarity with boys and girls and how they were growing up, and some of the differences that you classically see between boys and girls, but particularly it was a blood connection. It was skin in the game. What's happened with increased childlessness and smaller families and putting off children is that we've gone through about 3/4 of adults having at least a son or a daughter. That's falling down towards about 1/3 of men and women during their lifetime will have at least a son and at least one daughter. There's about 1/3 of people in the modern cohort that won't have children. They'll be childless for their whole lives. And then there's about another 1/3 who will only have boys or only have girls. It might be just one boy or two girls. So you can see how we've gone from the vast majority of our population having skin in the game and caring deeply about females and males to this fragmentation. And you've got a big cohort, like 1/3 of people, without any progeny, without a son or a daughter. So what's their skin in the game for the next generation? Do they have the same forward-looking concern that you do as an adult? Because I care deeply about my son and my daughter and the life that they will experience in the decades that unfurl, that will go on for many decades into the future. Whereas you've also got, say, mothers or fathers that only have a boy or only have 2 girls or only have 3 boys. So their lens is a bit narrow as well. Like, fathers of girls might care deeply about the education of their daughters and deeply about the financial independence and the careers and the opportunities available to their daughters. But is that at the expense of boys and young men having had opportunities taken away from them? So that's an aspect of social health that I don't think we've reflected on. It's demographic as well, so it's pretty much locked in for decades to come. You can't undo that. Unfortunately, that fragmentation will be a part of our societies for, at least 2 or 3 generations. If we ever see birth rates rising again up to a sustainable level.
David, it's fascinating when you consider the restructuring of what it means to be family with a sort of progress, or whatever you want to call it, the results of the sexual revolution and what I call on this podcast the LGBT cultural revolution, which now results in many single-sex relationships, many single-sex families, meaning there's couples who never have to deal with thinking about and considering the other sex, considering the needs and the wants and the desires of that which is other, which I think is such a healthy part of the way that we're designed to function, not consider things only from a masculine perspective, but to be aware of what the needs of my daughters might be, or that my wife might be. And then equally, when it comes to parental relationships, there is something lost. The data is attesting to there being something lost when children have only got parents of one sex. Now, I don't think you need the data to confirm that. I think there's a very clear and innate knowledge we would all have if we're willing to admit it, where we would recognize that the very best thing for a child is to have a male and a female in their lives, to have a father and a mother. It's not picking on people that are single parents, it's not picking on people who have ended up in different situations. It's just to say, if we were to consider what's best for a child, it's to have input from both the sexes. And something's missing when we don't have that. I think it's a very honouring way to look at it. It just sees the value in male and female created in the image of God. But David, I keep coming back to this work Dr. Joseph Nicolosi and many others have done over the years, which do look at these factors which appear to contribute to same-sex attraction, particularly in their context, it's unwanted same-sex attraction. And what they continue to find is, especially for males, is that a dysfunction in the family ultimately contributed to the development of their unwanted sexual desires, unwanted sexual behaviors. And in many cases, sometimes it's emotionally absent or physically absent fathers So I know this is unpopular, people don't want to talk about this, but this is in the literature. These are real studies, these are real individuals, these are real people I talk to on a daily basis. These are not a conspiracy to talk like this. There are people whose personal reflections are confirmed when they discuss this. They say, absolutely, there was something that I was missing in male affection or desiring, and perhaps there was something of an overbearing character in the way I was mothered. And again, we're not picking on mums or dads here, we're just looking at things. Can you see how they're, what males and females bring into a marriage, particularly in terms of how they can be confident in the role that their sex is supposed to bring to a marriage, the role that their sex is supposed to fulfill in a marriage? Can you see how there are other effects? There might be flow-on effects to the children where we've been diminishing men, or where culture's been diminishing men.
Yeah, I can see some. And I think Christians spiritually understand the importance of being raised by your mother and father, and about that dance of the masculine and feminine, and how important the complementarity is. I think what's interesting that we've seen in the last decade or two is that there's an alignment of our knowledge, our understanding about how people interact with the tradition and with the scripture and with the long learnt lessons that are embedded into Christianity. And so, for example, one thing you see in some of the literature is that boys raised in a couple that's both female or lesbian or very feminist, there's some evidence that boys raised in those situations have much worse outcomes than boys raised in an intact biological family. And that's very troubling to me, very troubling, because we can talk to Christians in the sense of biblical teachings and in the sense of the Christian covenant of marriage. But there's a bigger audience out there in the West and in English-speaking countries who don't necessarily resonate with that perspective, that who aren't religious or feel spiritually moved. And in that sense, perhaps it's more about human rights, in terms of a human right that every child has to active involvement and contact with both their biological father and their biological mother, in the sense that that can be empirically studied and verified. So that's one area I think is interesting, where there's been this growing alignment of our secular understanding coming towards what had been embedded in Christian teaching for millennia. The other aspect I think we need to reflect on is that some of the stereotypes that we have become used to are quite a modern phenomenon. You know, second wave feminism, in a sense, it was reacting to the post-World War II societies of the West, which, like I said, weren't normal. It wasn't a normal reflection of all of humanity. After World War I and after World War II, there had been two generations of young men who had been depleted. Remember male disposability that I talked about earlier? Well, they are two of the most recent generations that were most harmed and destroyed through so many young men being lost. And so there was an imperative in the Western countries and other countries to repopulate. And because of industrialization and work outside of the home and the Industrial Revolution, the model of that time was to have a breadwinner husband and a homemaker wife. That was the successful model that worked for those times. But it wasn't necessarily a reflection of all of humanity. Because if you go back before the Industrial Revolution, fathers were very close to the home and much more commonly actively involved in the lives and nurturing and raising and caring and teaching of all of the children. So that's much more reflective of the engagement that mothers and fathers had, being deeply embedded in the family unit, which was being present. So I think we probably overemphasised some of those stereotypes about post-World War II, about what it meant to be a man or a woman, what it meant to be a husband or a wife. And second wave feminism in particular was deconstructing some aspects of those post-World War II stereotypes. When I think about masculinity, what it means to have a mature manhood, I'm much more moved by Jesus Christ as a servant leader role model, and Joseph as well. In terms of being a father, I probably feel most closely aligned to Joseph. And those are very different in terms of the role modelling or the aspiration or the vision that they paint for men of all ages. Of course, we will never be anywhere close to being Jesus, to doing what Jesus did, to being a man of his worth. But we can aspire, and if we stray, he's there. There's forgiveness for us. There's an understanding that all humans are imperfect and that all humans sin. But we can keep walking forwards and taking steps in the right direction and be inspired by that vision and that role model.
Yeah, amen to that. To paraphrase what I'm hearing you say, Dave, is the response to toxic feminism is not the offended manosphere. It's not males defending male rights to do this or that. The healthy response to toxic feminism and unhelpful feminism is Christianity. As a man who looks like Christ, who endeavours to live like Christ by grace, aspiring to serve and to love and empty himself out, to pour himself out, that those he loves may live. That is such an excellent picture. I love that. Dave, maybe some parting words for people who are in the culture, maybe younger guys watching, girls watching. Are there any practical steps, at the grassroots level, any adaptations in our thinking, maybe some things that we could do to play our little part in what I would call the resurrection of culture, the resurrection of Western culture, of this great nation of Australia, and all of that, of course, beginning with the resurrection of the family unit and family structure. In other words, what can people do to create an environment for healthy families that raise up healthy young men and, of course, healthy young women?
It's so pleasing to see more young people turning to the church, sometimes for the first time in their lives. So pleasing. It's a great community, a welcoming community, particularly for young men who have been disparaged and denigrated and discriminated against in the secular world. I think a lot of people, young people in particular, are realising that secular societies meet only a small proportion of what we need as people, for our spirit, for purpose, for meaning in our lives. The rest has to be filled outside of that world, and Christian churches are a place that can fill those parts of your life. They are real relationships, real life people, not behind a screen, real people who care about you, who want to be part of your lives, who want to help you be a better person. And becoming a parent's hard. It's really hard. Governments aren't going to be the ones to make it easy. A little bit of extra money and a subsidy or some government services, it's not the game changer. We need each other. We have to embrace each other. Men and women collaborating together, the dance of masculine and feminine, that is what has successfully raised children and societies for millennia. That's what we have to turn back towards, what works, what we know is tried and tested. So I think it's really healthy to see young people in particular turning towards what we know is the truth, and that will give us salvation and will fill our lives with joy.
I love it, David. If I would summarise, I'd say turn back to God, turn to Jesus, find yourself in a healthy local church, read scripture, discover God's plan for your masculinity or your femininity, and let's put away with taking offense at the other sex, these anti-male narratives, which is helping nobody. Let's not buy into anti-female narratives either, for that matter, and celebrate the example that Christ sets for how we can live in sacrificial love for one another. David, I'm so encouraged. I'm so grateful for the work you've done, the voice that you are to young folks, to me, to many others, through your literature, through your work, through your writing, and just all the best, mate. Thanks for what you do, and thanks for being on the podcast. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Oh, thank you, David. That was awesome. Oh, let me stop this. Yeah.
There is an aspect of, the sort of social craze of LGBT and trans and queer. And, if you look at some of that data, in the US it peaked in 2023. And you've probably seen that data too, like identification of Gen Z with those categories. It just seems to have fallen a lot in the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah, really.